What frame rate should I use for filming my online content? Today I'll answer that question through my experience. Well, I try. I take for granted that you know what frames, frame rates, motion blur and shutter speed are, and if you don't, check some of my explanatory videos. First of all, we need to clarify that when we talk about frame rates, there are three distinct stages of the video making process where we need to keep those settings in mind. We talk about frame rates during the filming of a project, the video editing and the rendering upload. And what I do usually before even starting is to decide my project frame rate, which is basically my editing frame rate. If you film at 25 FPS, it's preferable to edit on a sequence which was set at 25 FPS and also export your video at 25 FPS. This will eliminate any issue that you could face during the video editing process, which we'll talk about in the next video, where we'll test what happens when we need to edit mixed frame rates footage. Creating videos for online platforms gives us the opportunity to choose the frame rate that best suits our need. And there are a few situations where we better choose some settings over others. So what are these factors that influence our choice? Let me start by telling you my preference, which is 25 FPS for many reasons. A habit, I come from Italy where they use the PAL system, so 25 FPS, and I grew up filming with that system. I worked in television for 10 years within European countries where they use the 25 FPS format. 25 FPS is the only whole number amongst the basic frame rates. 25 FPS is actually 25 images per second. We saw before in my previous video that instead 24 FPS is really 23.976 frames, and 30 FPS is actually 29.97. To be completely fair, there are cameras nowadays that offer the options to record either at 29.97 or 30 FPS and 23.976 frames or actual 24. So when it comes to math during the video editing process, definitely the 25 FPS is the easiest to me to work with. 25 FPS is also the closest frame rate to 24, which is the standard frame rate used for cinema and offers the most cinematic look. By the way, guys, I bet no one could really tell the difference between 24 and 25 frames per second. That's my opinion, and to be completely honest, after years of using cameras and doing video editing, I'm not sure if I can tell the difference between a 24 FPS video and a 30 FPS if I see it. So I choose my settings on more technical parameters rather than the cinematic look. Before diving into the project, for how silly it's gonna sound, I need to know my camera. I need to know what my camera is capable of, and I try to play with it as much as I can. I also create different presets with different frame rates, so on set I can actually switch and go through them very quickly. Particular codecs on certain cameras, like the B-RAW on the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, supports only certain frame rates. So in this camera I mentioned, the B-RAW only supports 24 frames per second. So if I wanted to film a video with the B-RAW settings, that's the only frame rate I could potentially use. We need to know that some cameras, for example, crop the sensor with certain frame rates or only record certain resolutions at that specific frame rate. For example, my GoPro could film 240 frames per second in HD, but it could also film 120 frames per second in Full HD. So higher frame rate or better resolution? That's a choice you need to make. Some high frame rates could also record with a lower bitrate, which means less quality. I remember my drone, the Mavic Pro, the first one, when I was filming at 60 frames per second, the quality of the video was horrible. So I went to Vietnam, I filmed a bunch of clips at 60 frames per second, and after watching the clips, I decided not to film at 60 frames per second any longer because it was really bad quality. So in that case, I chose the quality of the video rather than the frame rate. When I need to match two cameras, I make sure both can film the same frame rate because that's my priority for the video editing process. I need to know what I'm going to film. I need to know my project, so I need to have a brief or an idea of what's happening. For example, if I'm filming a message to camera, an interview or a vlog where I have only someone talking to the camera, then I would film at 25 FPS, edit at 25 FPS and export at 25 FPS as we mentioned above. But if I need to film an interview and also slow motion of certain action, then I choose my main project frame rate to be 25 FPS, film the talking parts at 25 FPS, and for the action I would choose some frame rates which are direct multiples of 25, which means either 50 frames per second or 100 frames per second. You could ask, why don't you film everything at 100 frames per second? Well, that's because more frames equals more data, which means bigger files, which means more storage needed, and also my workflow will be slower. So these are all things you want to keep in mind before choosing your frame rate. Is my computer going to keep up with certain frame rates and a demanding workflow, for example? I once filmed a parkour video at 240 frames per second on my GoPro and my computer couldn't move, so it kept crashing and freezing and I just couldn't work with it. So again, that's a frame rate I will never use again with my machine, for example. As we mentioned slow motion before, that's another point that could influence my choice. If I'm filming fast actions or sports where I want to exploit the maximum slow motion potentials of my camera, then I set my project frame rate to 24 FPS and film the action at 120 FPS. So you might ask, why don't you use 30 FPS instead of the 24 FPS for, the main project frame rate? Yes, 120 FPS is a direct multiple of 30, which means that if I put a 120 frames per second clip on a 30 FPS sequence, then I can slow down that clip exactly 4 times. So I can reduce its speed to 25% basically. But 120 is also the result of 24 by 5, which means that on a 24 FPS sequence, I can actually slow down the same clip down to 20%, which means I will get extra slow motion compared to the 30 FPS sequence. I recommend though to use slow motion only when it's needed, again for the issues we faced before about the workflow and the storage space. Another instance where I use slow motion 120 frames per second is during run and gun shoots. And if you don't know what run and gun shoots are, go and check my previous video. Sometimes during this type of shoots, you literally need to chase your subject. If I filmed an action of the duration of 1 second at 24 FPS, I would only have 1 second of that action. But if I film the same action at 120 frames per second, then I can slow down that clip 5 times, making it last 5 seconds instead. So in this case, filming at a higher frame rate could save my video. Choosing higher frame rates could also help us when we are filming handheld, for example. This is a trick to make your footage look more stable than what it actually is. A shaky clip that has been slowed down looks much smoother and stable than a clip at real speed. We might want to think about the right frame rate if we're planning to use our footage for any special animation or transition. For instance, if I wanted to create an animated mask with keyframes during the post-production process for a project at 25 FPS, that would mean that I will have to modify my mask 25 times per second. But if I filmed my clip at 120 frames per second and I wanted to create a mask on a sequence that was set at 120 frames per second, that means I will have to modify my mask 120 times. Good luck with that. Another factor that influences the choice of my frame rate is the condition of the light. As you know, the frame rate is strictly linked to the camera shutter speed, and usually in filmmaking we use a shutter speed which is double your frame rate. So for filming at 25 FPS, my shutter speed will need to be set at 1/50th of a second. That's the general rule anyway. Then rules are made to be broken. Now with a lower frame rate and a slower shutter speed, we'll have more light entering the sensor, so our image will look brighter than using a higher frame rate with a faster shutter speed, because of course there will be less light entering the sensor. That's why in dark places I use the lowest frame rate and slower shutter speed I possibly can. On the other hand, when my environment is too bright and, for example, I forgot my ND filter, which by the way is the best way to stop some light entering your sensor, I might switch the highest frame rate and the faster shutter speed. And I do so to compensate that extra amount of light entering inside my sensor. Again, it's not the best solution, but in many cases, trust me, it can save your shot. Now that we talked about light, we also need to talk about artificial lights, and that's another reason to choose a particular frame rate above another. That's a tricky one. Although light sources might appear continuous to our eye, many actually illuminate using high frequencies, pulses of light. Flickering results when the combination of shutter speed and frame rates captures different fractions of these pulses each frame. So when the light frequency and the frame rate are not in sync, basically. Most of the times you can fix this issue by trying different combinations of frame rates and shutter speed. And from my experience, again, to be honest, I don't think there's a right solution or a standard solution. So if this happens, I recommend to keep trying different settings until the flickering disappears. Sometimes you might end up with weird combinations and you might need to compromise on the motion blur as well. For instance, you might need to film at 120 FPS with a 1/120th shutter speed. So it's a bit weird, but it can work and it can fix the problem. One tip is to test your settings, so change your settings as you are recording and not when you are in standby mode. I remember using my Sony a7R III, for example, and it was behaving differently from the recording mode to the standby mode. So always make sure you change these settings as you are filming. So as you might have understood, choosing a frame rate is never as smooth and as straightforward as it seems. You also could start a project with a specific frame rate in your mind and then end up with other 5 completely different frame rates. That's why in the next video we'll see what happens when we try to edit different frame rates. Well, I tried to be as detailed as I could, and I hope this episode clarified a bit how to choose your frame rate. If it did, leave a comment down here below and consider to hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching. I will see you next week, and God bless you. See you soon.
Seems all good time